Which That Season Brings. Written by P.O. Dixon. Narrated by Christina Platt. Chapter 1. London, England, December 1811. Fitzwilliam Darcy's friend Charles Bingley paced the floor, pleading his case. His own sentiments a mixture of consternation and concern, the former watched in silence and waited. Contrary to Darcy's expectation, time and distance away from Miss Jane Bennet of Longbourn in Hertfordshire had done nothing to lessen his friend's fascination with the angelic creature. What a disappointment! For as much as Bingley may have fancied himself in love, Darcy had seen no such evidence of the lady's mutual esteem. In fact, he had gone out of his way to persuade himself that he was mistaken about Miss Bennet's regard for his friend the last time they were all in company, the evening of the Netherfield ball. True enough, the young lady had bestowed an abundance of lovely smiles upon his friend. Indeed, she listened to Bingley most attentively and nodded and smiled at all the right moments, but it was nothing that Darcy had not seen before. Charles was an amiable young man who made friends easily wherever he went. What young woman in want of a husband would not behave as Miss Bennet had done when she found herself the recipient of the unabashed adoration of a single young man with a large fortune? Having ceased his pacing in front of the blazing fireplace, Bingley ran his fingers through his untidy hair. "I know you contend that Miss Bennet does not care for me as I care for her," said Bingley, interrupting Darcy's musings. "I do not believe it, but even if it were true, it does not matter. Nothing would bring me more joy than to be close to the woman I love at Christmas time, to bask in her warm smiles as she is wont to bestow." "At the risk of sounding hard-hearted, Charles, might I remind you that I have heard you speak similarly of other young ladies before?" The younger man shook his head. "This time is different. I long for her. I have this feeling in the pit of my stomach that I ought to return to Netherfield just as I promised her that I would do once my business in town was concluded. I fear I shall never forgive myself if I do not keep my word. Can you not see how much this means to me?" Darcy shrugged. "I am not sure what you want me to say. What would you have me do?" "I want you to come with me. That is, if you are not previously engaged. Then you might see for yourself how mistaken you are about Miss Bennet's affections for me. She and I are designed for each other. I know it. Return with me to Netherfield Park, and you will know it too." Having prided himself on always taking such prodigious care of his young friend, Darcy did not relish the thought of denying him this one request. What was more, the idea of spending the season alone held little appeal to Darcy. What with his sister visiting a friend, and her family in Bath, and his Aunt Lady Catherine de Bourgh and his cousin Miss Anne de Bourgh visiting their Fitzwilliam relations at the Matlock estate in Derbyshire. Of course, he had been invited to visit the Matlock estate too. But, between Lady Catherine's insistence he must marry Anne, and his aunt, Lady Ellen Fitzwilliam, the Countess of Matlock, insisting he choose a bride from among the prominent families of the ton, being in Matlock was the last thing in the world he wanted. On the other hand, Bingley's family members were not to be counted among Darcy's most desired companions for the Christmas season either, especially as he had recently spent the better part of autumn in company with them as Bingley's guest in Hertfordshire. Darcy said, "I understand that families ought to be together at Christmas, and it is for that reason I cannot even consider accompanying you to Hertfordshire. No doubt your family will join you." "You're in luck, my friend. My sister Louisa and her husband Hurst have other plans, and Caroline will not consider returning to Netherfield without her. I dare say, even with the prospect of spending Christmas in company with you." Those particular words were inducement enough. Miss Bingley's treatment of the Bennets was beyond the pale. In truth, his own behaviour, when in company with her, left much to be desired. His role in any disparagement of the Bennet family was mainly in keeping with his attempt to ward off the lady's relentless teasing about his admiration for the second eldest Bennet daughter's fine eyes. Yet, that was no excuse. "Miss Elizabeth Bennet?" Darcy would be lying were he to pretend that he did not think of her just as much as his friend Bingley professed longing for Miss Jane Bennet, albeit for different reasons. While Bingley fancied himself in love with the young woman whom he had known less than a few months, Darcy's preoccupation with Miss Elizabeth had nothing at all to do with love. It has more to do with the bewildering effect the young woman has on my sensibilities. Darcy had never been so bewitched by any woman as he was by her. How else was he to explain the fact he had singled her out to dance during the Netherfield ball? He was not pleased with the way the two of them had left things that evening, arguing over George Wickham of all people, and her spirited defence of the scoundrel as though she was utterly oblivious of the honour he had bestowed her in singling her out for a dance at the ball. On the other hand, my leave-taking has effectively left Miss Elizabeth vulnerable to that scoundrel. The least I might do is return to Hertfordshire to warn her of the perils that such a man of Wickham's low character poses to her. Thus resolved, Darcy said, I shall happily accompany you to Netherfield, my friend. Bingley's satisfaction with this response was all that might be expected, and in no time at all the departure date was set. Interestingly enough, Darcy suffered an odd sense of relief mixed with anticipation, as though a burden he did not even realise he had suffered had been lifted. I do not think I would ever forgive myself were Miss Elizabeth to fall victim to Wickham's charms. Chapter 2. Hertfordshire, Longbourn Village. Merriment and joy filled the halls of Longbourn House, and it had very little to do with the season. At the centre of all the excitement was not the two younger Bennet daughters, Kitty and Lydia, who had rightfully earned their reputations as being the silliest girls in all of England, nor was it the older daughters, Jane, Elizabeth, or Mary, who were also considered to be rather silly, and by their own father no less. No, it was the lady of the house, Mrs. Fanny Bennet, whose jubilation could not be repressed. A woman of mean understanding who fancied herself discontented whenever it suited her purposes, she burst into the dining parlour where everyone else in the family sat around the heavily laden table enjoying their breakfast. "Oh, Mr. Bennet," said the lady to her husband of more than 23 years, "we are saved, I declare, we are saved." "Whatever do you mean, my dear?" Mr. Bennet asked with scarcely a glance above his morning paper. "Have you not heard the news? Mr. Bingley is planning to return to Netherfield Park. He is said to be arriving any day now, and no later than Boxing Day, to be sure." Having known her own share of beauty during her youth, Mrs. Bennet's chief occupation of late was marrying off her 5 daughters, each of them in their turn. Her life's solace was visiting and news. This combining of the two was a great cause for joy indeed. She placed her hand on her bosom, willing her racing heartbeat to still. "Oh, what a blessing this is for our eldest daughter! What a blessing this is for all of us!" "A blessing, you say? Since when does a man returning to his own home warrant such accolades? I dare say I have gone away and returned to Longbourn on any number of occasions with no such exultations." "Oh, Mr. Bennet, how can you be so tiresome? You know very well that Mr. Bingley means to take Jane off our hands once and for all." Elizabeth, the second-born daughter, placed her hand on her elder sister Jane's arm. The latter smiled, which was her wont to do on such an occasion as this, but it was hardly convincing, for Elizabeth knew how much Mr. Charles Bingley's departure from Netherfield, with the explicit promise of a prompt return, had injured her dearest sister when the promise was broken. To add insult to her injury, the gentleman's sister, Miss Caroline Bingley, had written to Jane shortly they arrived in London, stating that the gentleman had no plans to return at all. Elizabeth could not speak for her sister, but for her own part, Miss Bingley's words were etched in her memory. "When my brother left us yesterday, he imagined that the business which took him to London might be concluded in 3 or 4 days. But as we are certain it cannot be so, and at the same time convinced that when Charles gets to town he will be in no hurry to leave it again, We have determined on following him thither, that he may not be obliged to spend his vacant hours in a comfortless hotel. Many of my acquaintances are already there for the winter. I wish that I could hear that you, my dearest friend, had any intention of making one of the crowd, but of that I despair. I sincerely hope your Christmas in Hertfordshire may abound in the gaieties which that season generally brings, and that your beaux will be so numerous as to prevent your feeling the loss of those of whom we shall deprive you. Even if Jane had chosen to accept Miss Bingley's testimony that Mr. Bingley did not intend to return for the winter, despite his having promised her otherwise, Elizabeth was not so easily persuaded of the gentleman's indifference. However, as days absent turned into weeks, Elizabeth too had begun to give up hope. "I have learned that his sisters will not accompany him," Mrs. Bennet cried. "Oh, I shall be most delighted if Mr. Bingley would bring along some of his single gentleman friends. That would be most fortunate for our other girls." "How so, my dear?" "Why, so they may marry some of them, of course." Here Mr. Bennet looked up from his paper, directly at his second eldest. "Perhaps he shall bring his good friend Mr. Darcy with him." Elizabeth raised her cup to her lips, mostly to mask her bewilderment. "No doubt papa's words were meant for me, but why? Does he know something I do not know? Why is papa looking at me?" "Oh, bother Mr. Darcy!" his lady exclaimed with energy. "I should hope we never have to lay eyes on that particular gentleman again." Elizabeth could not say with certainty that she disagreed with her mother. She could not say she agreed either. The time she was together with the gentleman had left her exceedingly puzzled. Even now, her heart skipped a beat with the mention of his name. "I am surprised to hear you say such a thing, my dear. The gentleman did single my Lizzie out for a dance at the Netherfield ball, did he not? Is dancing not one of the most highly recommended means for encouraging affection?" "I've often heard it said that poetry is the food of love," Mary interjected somewhat tentatively. "Poetry? Dancing? What difference does it make? Everyone who knows anything knows the tall, proud man fancies himself above all our company," cried Mrs. Bennet. "Unless anyone forgets he said Lizzie was not handsome enough to tempt him," young Lydia exclaimed. Elizabeth shifted a little in her chair, knowing she had no one to blame for this constant reminder of Mr. Darcy's cruel words other than herself. After all, she had been the only person in Hertfordshire to overhear his remark to his friend Charles Bingley during the Meryton Assembly all those weeks ago, and she had been the one to repeat the insulting sentiment to almost anyone who would listen as a means of assuaging her bruised ego. "No, one must never forget what that haughty man said about our Lizzie," said Mrs. Bennet. As though not content to let the subject end there, her father said, "What say you, my Lizzie? How do you feel about the prospect of Mr. Darcy's return?" "So long as Mr. Bingley returns to Hertfordshire, as I always knew he would, he could be accompanied by 10 Mr. Darcys, and it would make no difference to me. Jane's happiness is my only concern." She looked at her sister, wishing for a glimpse beyond Jane's angelic smile to determine how she really felt about this intelligence. Before Elizabeth could fashion her next sentence, her sister Kitty said, "And she is happy. Just look how radiant she is." "As she very well ought to be," Mrs. Bennet said. "Have I not always said my Jane cannot be so beautiful for nothing? Mark my words, there will be a wedding at Netherfield in under 3 months." As happy as part of Elizabeth was on her elder sister's behalf, she could not help being bothered by her mother's prognostication. Indeed, a significant part of her blamed her mother for Jane's sufferings of late. The other part of her blamed none other than Mr. Darcy. The former because she had boasted aloud of an impending marriage between Jane and Mr. Bingley during the Netherfield ball, and the latter because he had heard it and, no doubt, in Elizabeth's busy mind, acted upon it were she to judge by the ensuing disgust that was written all over his face. Elizabeth suspected that Mr. Darcy had as much a part to play in Mr. Bingley's absence from his own home at Netherfield Park as did Bingley's pernicious sister, Miss Bingley. Elizabeth had confided part of this to her sister Jane, and gone even further to suggest that Jane must return to town with their London relations, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, after Christmas, so that Jane might put herself directly in Mr. Bingley's path. As though their thoughts tended along similar lines, Mrs. Bennet said, "It looks like our Jane will have no need to return to town with my brother and sister after all." Kitty asked, "Oh, can I go in Jane's stead?" She turned to the youngest. "May both Lydia and I go?" "La!" Lydia exclaimed. "Why should I wish to go to London when there are officers encamped as far as the eyes can behold within a stone's throw away?" How it vexed Elizabeth to hear her younger sister rattle on and on about the officers who were encamped just outside of Meryton. The last thing Lydia needed was the opportunity to make herself, as well as her family, ridiculous. And yet, the young girl relished in that prospect, oftentimes with her own mother's encouragement. Alas, it is the business of mamma's life to find husbands for her daughters. Mrs. Bennet thought she had done her part at least where the two eldest daughters were concerned. She had all but arranged for Jane to marry Mr. Bingley and Elizabeth to marry a Mr. William Collins, the heir apparent to the Longbourn estate. Now there was a chance for the former failed attempt to be reconciled. But as for the latter, a second chance was never to be, which suited Elizabeth perfectly well, for she had rejected Collins' proposal of marriage and in no uncertain terms, effectively sending him into the arms of her intimate friend, Miss Charlotte Lucas, and likewise rendering herself a lost cause in the eyes of her dear mother. Her mother's pained vexations were such that Elizabeth would not soon forget. "Come here, child," her father had cried as she appeared in his library after being summoned by her distraught mother. "I have sent for you on an affair of importance. I understand that Mr. Collins has made you an offer of marriage. Is that true?" "Yes, papa, it is true," Elizabeth had replied. "Very well. And this offer of marriage you have refused?" She nodded. "I have, sir." "Very well. We now come to the point. Your mother insists upon your accepting it. Is it not so, Mrs. Bennet?" "Yes, or I will never see her again." "An unhappy alternative is before you, Elizabeth. From this day you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do." Having received her father's support in such a life-changing matter, Elizabeth could not help smiling at such a conclusion, but Mrs. Bennet, who had persuaded herself that her husband regarded the affair as she wished, was excessively disappointed. Till that day, Mrs. Bennet's ire had not abated in the least. "Hush!" cried her mother. "Neither of you will go. I mean for your sister Miss Lizzie to go, for she is the one who needs to find herself a husband. I did everything in my power to make an excellent match for your headstrong sister, and what did she do but spurn me at every turn? Let her go to London and see for herself just how trying my job really is. I declare it is far, far more than I deserve." Chapter 3. Darcy was standing by the fireplace in Bingley's elder sister's parlour, warming his hands, when Miss Caroline Bingley sashayed into the room. A comely young lady with a flair for all that was fashionable, Miss Bingley was everything that Darcy did not desire in a woman. "Mr. Darcy, what a lovely surprise seeing you this morning. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Rather than greeting the young lady in the usual way, Darcy folded one arm over the other. "You invited me here this morning, did you not, Miss Bingley?" "But of course, I suppose I am merely surprised by the promptness of your arrival." "Your servant did say you wished to discuss a matter of great urgency." "Pray have a seat, and I shall ring for tea." "This is not exactly a social call. As you no doubt are aware, your brother and I are planning to travel to Hertfordshire very soon. I have a number of other matters to attend in preparation for my leave-taking." "Indeed, Charles spoke of your plans late yesterday. He went out of his way to emphasize that only you were invited." "He said that you and your sister were previously engaged." "True, but some engagements are meant to be broken," Miss Bingley replied. "I think I should join the two of you in Hertfordshire.
Heaven knows that is the last place on earth I would wish to be during such a festive season, especially when so many of my friends are in town, but I am willing to make the sacrifice for the sake of my brother's future felicity.
Perhaps you should not. Consider this, if you will, Miss Bingley. Your presence will rather encourage Charles to host his neighbours, what with your presiding over his table, would it not? Who is to say that he will not go so far as to give another ball, what with the success of the last one? Whereas your absence will effectively preclude such a possibility.
I suppose you are correct, Mr. Darcy,
the young woman conceded. Of course I am. Trust me, everyone is better served by your remaining here in London. With so many of your closest friends here for the winter, as you say, you shall have no want of festive diversions.
Very well, I shall not join my brother in Hertfordshire. Saying that, I shall rely upon you to see that Charles does not find himself a hapless victim of that dreadful family. I shall be forever in your debt for your service to my brother just last month. I should hate to suppose all our best efforts to separate him from Miss Jane Bennet's smiles were in vain.
Darcy eyed the young lady intently. I will only promise to encourage your brother and my close friend to behave in a manner which serves his best interest. For the Gardeners, this Christmas season promised to be a little different from the Christmas before at Longbourn Village, what with more eager anticipation from their own children, who were getting older and beginning to appreciate the spirit of the season. Mrs. Gardiner threw a loving look at each of her 4 children, ranging in age from 4 to 10, each in their turn. They were growing up so fast. Soon they might not be so agreeable to being packed up and whisked off to Longbourn for the Christmas season. Their country cousins are such favourites of the children, but my nieces are of an age where soon they will have husbands and start families of their own. Again, Mrs. Gardiner regarded each of her offspring with a smile. Who is to say how many Christmases to come we shall all have the pleasure of celebrating at Longbourn? Mrs. Gardiner could hardly think of the Bennets at that time of year without giving a thought to their tenuous situation as a consequence of the entail on their family home to the male line of the family. Not that she relished the morbid sentiments that inevitably came, but she was too intelligent not to know and understand what such a prospect would mean for her relations and even her own family. For her husband being the wealthiest, even if not the oldest brother of Mrs. Fanny Bennet's 2 brothers, there was a certain, often explicitly stated, expectation that Mr. Gardiner would be the one to fill in any voids that might result in the event of Mr. Bennet's untimely passing. "Why, we shall be thrown in the hedgerow," rang throughout Mrs. Gardiner's ears. It was her sister-in-law's favourite refrain whenever they were together, as familiar to her as a Christmas carol. If she did not know better, Mrs. Gardiner might easily expect her children could sing their aunt's sad, sad song word by word, too. A favourite of her nieces, Mrs. Gardiner looked forward to spending time with each of them. This visit promised many hours surrounded by the 2 youngest girls looking at fashion magazines. Both were under the age of 17, and already both were out in society. As fate would have it, the militia was encamped outside of Meryton. No doubt my young nieces, Kitty and Lydia, will regale me with endless tales of their acquaintance with handsome officers in red coats, and given that they cannot be bothered with writing letters, I must look forward to hearing of their exploits going all the way back to the moment of the officer's arrival. From her niece Mary, Mrs. Gardiner expected that she and her family would be the beneficiaries of a lengthy exhibition as soon as they were settled in at Longbourn from their travels. She could actually say she looked forward to such an evening, for such calm tranquility would be replaced by the frenzy that being in a household of children, several teenage girls, and an excitable sister-in-law entailed. And was Mrs. Bennet ever excited? Mrs. Gardiner sighed. When has my sister-in-law ever had more cause for excitability laced with vexation than this year? The causes of said vexation had been the most frequently mentioned occurrence in her letters from Longbourn of late. The defection of Mr. Charles Bingley, a single man of large fortune who had let the neighbouring estate of Netherfield Park, who was meant to marry the eldest Bennet daughter, and the betrayal of Mr. William Collins, the heir apparent of Longbourn,
who had proposed to Miss Charlotte Lucas behind Mrs. Bennet's back when everyone knew he was supposed to choose a bride from among her daughters. Indeed, such were the lady's complaints as written by her repeatedly. Mrs. Gardiner's favourite niece, Elizabeth, wrote of the two incidences in quite a different fashion. Indeed, Mr. Bingley had left Hertfordshire with the promise of an imminent return, and in failing to do so, had been the means of breaking her sister's heart. And although it was plain for all to see that he liked Jane very much, there had been no promise of a future of marital felicity between them. As for Mr. Collins, Elizabeth had stated in no uncertain terms that she would not have him, owing to his ridiculous, sycophantic nature. His so-called betrayal was, in Elizabeth's way of thinking, one of the best things that ever happened to her. Her only regret was that her mother was determined to make Elizabeth's life miserable as a consequence of her rejection. For that reason, as much as any other, Mrs. Gardiner could not wait to arrive at Longbourn, so she might be of some comfort to her favourite nieces, Elizabeth and Jane. It had already been decided that the eldest Bennet daughter would return to London with them. If my dearest Lizzie's situation is as dire as her letters suggest, perhaps I shall persuade her to return to town with us as well.
Chapter 4. As the younger Bennet daughters went merrily about their way, decking the halls of Longbourn with boughs of holly, ivy, and much-needed strategically arranged sprigs of mistletoe, according to Lydia, Jane merely acted the part. Angelic eyes, which otherwise sparkled during that particular time of the year, were somewhat less so of late. Elizabeth could only attribute it to the imminent return of Mr. Charles Bingley. Not that Jane did not long for his return, but her mother's constant prognostications that the gentleman's purpose in coming was to offer his hand in marriage to Jane were taking their toll on Jane's sensibilities. She told her sister Elizabeth as much when the two of them were alone. "I begin to be sorry he comes at all," said Jane in all earnest. "I can hardly bear to hear it thus perpetually talked of." "Mamma means well," replied Elizabeth, as a means of consoling her sister. "No doubt, but she does not know, no one can know, how much I suffer from what she says. Happy shall I be when his stay at Netherfield is over." "I wish I could say anything to comfort you," replied Elizabeth, "but it is wholly out of my power. I have first-hand knowledge of the unpleasant effects of Mamma's lamentations. Her repeated exultations are no less vexing." She took Jane by the hand. "Soon enough, our aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, will arrive for Christmas, along with our uncle and our little cousins. Pray, the addition of so many loved ones to our family circle will temper Mamma's fascination with what may or may not happen when the Netherfield party returns." Some hours later, the Longbourn household was blessed by the much-anticipated arrival of the Gardiner family. The first part of Mrs. Gardiner's business was to distribute her presents and describe the newest fashions. When this was done, she had a less active part to play, and it became her turn to listen. Mrs. Bennet had her share of grievances to relate and much to complain of. They had all been very ill-used since she last saw her sister. 2 of her girls had been upon the point of marriage, only to have nothing become of it. Just as Mrs. Gardiner had taught herself to expect, her sister's greater disappointment centred on Elizabeth.
"Obstinate, headstrong girl!"
Mrs. Bennet exclaimed.
"Oh, sister, it is very hard to think that she might have been Mr. Collins's wife by this time, had it not been for her own perverseness. He made her an offer in this very room, and she refused him. The consequence of it is that Lady Lucas will have a daughter married before I have, and that the Longbourn estate is just as much entailed as ever. The Lucases are very artful people indeed, sister. They are all for what they can get. I am sorry to say it of them, but so it is. It makes me very nervous and poorly to be thwarted so in my own family, and to have neighbours who think of themselves before anybody else. However, I do believe we are to be the recipients of a Christmas miracle so far as my Jane is concerned, for Mr. Bingley is said to be returning to Netherfield Park any day. What other reason would he return if not to marry my Jane? He is also rumoured to be accompanied solely by a gentleman friend, for his sisters will remain in town. Why, I might very well be blessed with 2 future sons-in-law at least."
That, and your coming for Christmas, is the greatest of comforts.
and I am very glad to hear what you tell us of long sleeves.
Having received the chief of this news before, save Mr. Bingley's imminent return, in the course of Jane and Elizabeth's correspondence with her, Mrs. Gardiner made her sister a slight answer and, in compassion for her nieces, turned the conversation. When alone with Elizabeth afterward, she spoke more on the subject. Mr. Bingley's imminent return is good news, indeed. I shall look forward to meeting the young man. I truly hope my sister's optimism is well-founded, and his return is a true sign of his constancy.
I certainly hope it is too, said Elizabeth. It would most assuredly reaffirm my belief in love, for the notion that the interference of friends will persuade a young man of independent fortune to think no more of a girl whom he was violently in love with only a few days before is one I do not wish to accept as a possibility.
I rather consider the expression of violently in love is so hackneyed, so doubtful, so indefinite, that it gives me very little idea. It is often applied to feelings which arise from a half-hour's acquaintance as to a real strong attachment.
I might easily concede your point, but if ever the expression was aptly applied, it is in this case. I never saw a more promising inclination. Bingley was growing quite inattentive to other people and wholly engrossed by her. Every time they met, it was more decided and remarkable. At his own ball, he offended 2 or 3 young ladies by not asking them to dance. I spoke to him twice myself without receiving an answer. Could there be finer symptoms? Is not general incivility the very essence of love?
If the kind of love you espouse is indeed the kind of love he feels for Jane, then she is a lucky woman indeed. I only pray his return does not further disappoint, because, with her disposition, she may never get over it. Whereas if such a disappointment were to happen to you, Lizzie, you would laugh yourself out of it soon enough.
I shall not argue the veracity of your assertion, dearest aunt, but I dare say it is a sad testament to my female sensibilities. I have often heard it said that a girl likes to be a little crossed in love every once in a while. Wish me anything other than I might be denied such an enviable prospect. Such a worthy distinction is something no one should ever live without.
Chapter 5. The first of many such occasions planned for the duration of the gardener's stay was an engagement at Longbourn. Some of the officers, of which Mr. Wickham was sure to be one, were among the guests. Mrs. Gardiner, rendered suspicious by Elizabeth's warm commendation by way of her letters, carefully observed them both throughout the evening. Without supposing them to be very seriously in love, from what she saw, their preference of each other was plain enough to make her a little uneasy. Thus, she resolved to speak to Elizabeth on the subject so soon as she could, and represent to her niece the imprudence of encouraging such an attachment. Having spent a fair amount of time speaking with the officer herself, Mrs. Gardiner could well understand why her nieces considered him such a favourite. Here was a gentleman capable of rendering even threadbare topics on the weather, and the like, fascinating. To Mrs. Gardiner, Wickham had one means of affording pleasure wholly unconnected with his general powers, for their former lives in Derbyshire afforded the two of them any number of mutual acquaintances. Talk of old friends in general, and Pemberley in particular, invoked in Mrs. Gardiner sentiments that bore a mixture of pleasure and circumspect. How one man could be so utterly charming and yet so disquietly jaded was a cause for concern, giving Mrs. Gardiner to wonder what indeed Mr. Wickham was about. Her caution to Elizabeth was punctually and kindly given on the first favourable opportunity of speaking to her alone. After honestly telling her what she thought, she thus continued, "You are too sensible a girl, Lizzie, to fall in love merely because you are warned against it. Therefore, I am not afraid of speaking openly. Seriously, I would have you be on your guard. Do not involve yourself or endeavour to involve Mr. Wickham in an affection which the want of fortune would make so very imprudent. I have nothing to say against him even if I am not completely free of concern. I suppose it is a consequence of my steadfast belief that you can do so much better than to give over your independence, your livelihood, and dare I say your felicity, to the somewhat limited means of a foot soldier.
Who is to say that I am not of a mind that wealth and status are not prerequisites for happiness in marriage?"
The older woman arched her brow. Lizzie, you must not let such fanciful notions run away with you. You have sense, and we all expect you to use it. Your father would depend on your resolution and good conduct, I am sure. Surely you would not wish to disappoint your father?
My dear aunt, you are being very serious.
Yes, and I hope you will be serious as well.
Then you need not suffer any alarm. I will take care of myself, and of Mr. Wickham too. He shall not be in love with me, if I can prevent it.
Elizabeth, said Mrs. Gardiner in a graver, slightly admonishing tone.
I beg your pardon. I will try again. At present, I am not in love with Mr. Wickham, but he is, beyond all comparison, the most agreeable man I ever saw.
Pray continue, Mrs. Gardiner implored.
I can only say that if he becomes really attached to me, I believe it will be better that he should not. I see the imprudence of it. My father's opinion of me does me the highest honour, and I should be miserable to forfeit it.
Elizabeth and her aunt, upon parting, were both assured that the kind hints from the latter had not been offered in vain. Later, while wandering about the lanes in want of a reprieve from all the excitement at Longbourn, Elizabeth reflected on her aunt's advice. How ironic that her Aunt Gardiner had offered advice best provided by a mother. How ironic indeed, for her mother would never caution one of her daughters against marriage, however advantageous such an alliance might or might not be. Smiling inside, Elizabeth could well imagine what her dear mother's advice might have been.
Far better that the burden of caring for you should fall to a husband than an unappreciated mother with more than her fair share of single daughters to get rid of.
Chapter 6. Any time Elizabeth was fortunate enough to meet her friend Miss Charlotte Lucas on one of her early morning walks was a happy time. Not only were those times growing fewer, sadly, there would be no such incidences at all once Charlotte became Mrs. Charlotte Collins. Elizabeth did not know which bothered her the most, that she was losing her intimate friend, or that her friend had willingly accepted a future life with a ridiculous man by her side. Experience had taught her that what remaining time she had with Charlotte in Hertfordshire was best not squandered with the talk of Charlotte's marital felicity. Besides, talk of Mr. Bingley's return was all anyone who knew and loved Jane considered worth discussing.
I say Mr. Bingley's return is a very good thing for our Jane. Let us pray she is far more encouraging of his admiration than before. I've said it once, and I shall say it again. If a woman conceals her affection with the same skill from the object of it, she may lose the opportunity of fixing him. What better time than that for Elizabeth to question her friend's stratagems in securing such a hasty proposal from her own intended? But, thinking better of it, she held her tongue. Charlotte continued. I should hate to see her disappointed in love a second time by the same man. Nor I, to be sure. But I have to suppose that Mr. Bingley's coming at Christmas is a strong symptom of his affection for Jane, when he might very well have simply remained in town. No doubt London is very diverting. What if Mr. Bingley's good friend Mr. Darcy accompanies him? Elizabeth swallowed. It was not as though she had not silently asked herself that very same question a time or two since learning of Mr. Bingley's plans. Her own father had speculated on a possible return of the proud man as well, and, oddly enough, so far as Elizabeth was concerned, what it might mean to her. I am quite persuaded he will not, Elizabeth asserted. But what if he does? Charlotte's tone indicated she was just as determined to receive a definitive response from her friend as Elizabeth was determined not to offer one. Elizabeth shrugged. I am certain Mr. Darcy's possible return can have nothing at all to do with me. You say that, but everyone we know bore witness to the honour he bestowed in asking you to stand opposite him at the Netherfield ball. Honour? Why must I consider dancing with Mr. Darcy such an honour? I have danced with any number of gentlemen, have I not? Including the night of the Netherfield ball. Indeed, but you are the only woman beyond his intimate circle whom Mr. Darcy danced with. For the sake of putting an end to this topic, I will allow that what you say is true, and I will go even further by pointing out the obvious. The obvious, Charlotte repeated, her eyes as well as her voice questioning. Indeed, the obvious, for, despite the honour the gentleman bestowed upon me, there has been nary a single word spoken between the two of us hence.
What say you now, dear Charlotte?" Charlotte grinned. "I say only this. What if Mr. Bingley's good friend, Mr. Darcy, accompanies him?"
"Oh, Charlotte, you are absolutely incorrigible."
Her attitude turning to wistfulness, Elizabeth continued, "What in heavens shall I do without you?" Chapter 7. Christmas Eve came and went, as did Christmas Day, along with all the gaieties which those days were wont to bring. The eve of the first was replete with a Yule log on the fire and the exchanging of gifts, and the morning of the second was spent in church among friends and neighbours. Indeed, all was exactly as it ought to be throughout the halls of Longbourn House. Almost, for as festive as the 2 days proved to be, neither day brought the one thing Mrs. Bennet desired most. The arrival of the day after Christmas, or rather the arrival of Mr. Bingley, was a balm for Mrs. Bennet's vexations that he may never come, as well as her family's relief in seeing its effect on Mrs. Bennet. Immediately upon receiving confirmation, she commenced counting the hours that must pass before her family could finally receive him at Longbourn. Oh, if Mr. Bennet had only taken it upon himself to call at Netherfield as soon as his wife heard the news, and all but begged him to do so, the lady's ebbing anxiety and woes would have been all but prevented. A constant vigil at the window was thereby required of all her daughters, lest they might be unprepared to receive their wayward neighbour when he eventually came to call. Kitty was the fortunate daughter to espy the young man's arrival early the next day.
"There is a gentleman with him, mamma," she cried. "Whoever could it be? As long as he is handsome, what does it matter?"
young Lydia asked, rushing to her sister's side to see what she could see. Mrs. Bennet said,
"It is some acquaintance or other, to be sure, my dear. And your sister is correct. As long as he is handsome, what does it matter?"
"And single," Lydia added, giggling. "And wealthy," Mary added somewhat derisively. She shrugged nonchalantly in response to her sister Elizabeth's ensuing silent, yet half-hearted rebuke.
"La," replied Kitty, "it looks just like that man that used to be with him before. What's his name? That tall, proud man." "Good gracious, Mr. Darcy!"
Confirming the arrival of the haughty gentleman from Derbyshire with her own eyes, Mrs. Bennet scoffed.
"And so it is, I vow. Well, any friend of Mr. Bingley's will always be welcomed here, to be sure, but I must say that I hate the very sight of proud Mr. Darcy."
"Mamma!" Jane and Elizabeth cried in unison, the latter giving a silent prayer that her mother's imminent reception of Mr. Darcy would belie her true sentiments. Scattered about the parlour, the Longbourn ladies all stood straight and tall when the housekeeper showed the visitors into the room.
"Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy,"
the servant said, and then quit the room. Bingley, upon entering, seemed hesitant at first, but a warm look and a smile from Jane gave him to know he was quite safe with her, and absolved him from his omissions, and thus compelled him to go directly to her, bow, and take his place by her side. Elizabeth, with a triumphant smile, glanced toward his friend. Though she did not mean for it to happen, their eyes met and held fast on each other's for a moment or two. This, Mr. Darcy must have read as encouragement, for he placed himself directly by Elizabeth's side. On the other hand, she could not blame him for choosing to stand next to her. "The gentleman cannot have missed my family's warm reception of his friend Bingley in comparison to his own." Finding herself coming to Mr. Darcy's defence against her mother's impolitic behaviour was nothing new. She had done so on a number of occasions during their acquaintance. She accepted her burden with a mixture of relief and vexation. Relief because her mother's grievances against the gentleman often evidenced themselves in the most embarrassing fashion. Vexation because she had her own grievances against him, the greatest of which had been the means of a somewhat contentious debate between them the last time they were together at the Netherfield ball, right there on the dance floor for everyone to see, perhaps even hear, how vehement her preference for George Wickham was. As leery as Elizabeth was of Mr. Darcy's return to Hertfordshire, she could not be too disturbed by his presence. "Surely his being here is a sign of his approval of Mr. Bingley's courtship of my sister Jane." If she were to judge by the looks that passed between the gentlemen, not only had Mr. Darcy given his friend permission to be happy, but he was silently encouraging his friend even as they stood there. Elizabeth began to suspect that she had been wrong in blaming Mr. Darcy for Bingley's defection. At the very least, she had not been entirely correct. After all the usual civilities were exchanged and everyone was seated, Mrs. Bennet said,
"There have been quite a few developments since you were last here, Mr. Bingley."
She nodded.
"Miss Charlotte Lucas, for one, is recently engaged, I'm sorry to say. She is to be married in less than a fortnight, I'm told."
Taken aback by the lady's candour, Bingley cried, "I have been given to believe that engagements are a cause for joy."
"Oh, indeed they are, when they unfold naturally, as opposed to the consequence of the conniving machination of the less deserving, and the foolish obstinacy of a more deserving, nay, more entitled prospect."
Elizabeth could feel her colour rise, and thus was compelled to say something for fear of her mother's next words. "My friend Charlotte is to be married to our cousin, Mr. William Collins." She looked at Bingley. "You may recall having met him." "Yes, indeed, I recall he is your aunt's vicar," he said, looking at his friend. "Is that not correct, Darcy?" Darcy nodded, thus confirming his friend's declaration. "Soon enough my friend will be off to Kent, where she intends to be very contented," said Elizabeth in the best imitation of a proud, supportive friend she could muster.
"Oh, of that I have very little doubt," exclaimed Mrs. Bennet. "Miss Lucas is nothing if not resourceful."
"How is your family, sir?" Jane asked, continuing to conspire with her sister to steer the conversation away from Mr. Collins and Charlotte and what they had done. "My sisters and my brother Hurst are getting along very well. They send their regrets that they were unable to join me," Mrs. Bennet said.
"Your sister's absence is a loss indeed, but I see no reason why it should impede your happiness. Indeed, their loss is our gain, for as I recall you are quite in my debt, Mr. Bingley. I seem to recall that when you went to town last month, you promised to take a family dinner with us as soon as you returned. I assure you I was very much disappointed that you did not come back sooner and keep your engagement."
Bingley looked a little silly at this reflection and said something of his concern at having been delayed for so long by business.
"Well, you are here now. I should not presume to ask you to join us this very evening, but I must prevail on you to join us here at Longbourn on the morrow for a gathering of family and good friends, and I will not take no for an answer. My brother and my sister from town, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, are visiting us, and I am sure they are looking forward to making your acquaintance."
"I shall be delighted to join you here at Longbourn, as will my friend Darcy, if I may speak for him." Darcy nodded his acceptance. "We shall be honoured." Shortly after that, Mrs. Bennet contrived to leave Jane and Bingley alone in hopes that the most anticipated marriage proposal might be forthcoming, but she could not very well force their other guest to take his leave. Thus, she surrendered the task of diverting Mr. Darcy to her second eldest daughter. The lady and her three youngest hastily fled the room, leaving Jane and Bingley in one part, and Elizabeth and Darcy in another. For Elizabeth's part, she was not sure what to expect of Bingley's taciturn friend. Their last conversation had been riddled with contention. The last thing she wanted was to resume where they had left off. "Especially now, for it is the Christmas season, a time for goodwill toward all. Certainly the time of year which affords a license to hope for the best." Chapter 8. Upon entering the parlour, Darcy found himself drawn to Elizabeth just as much as he had ever been. The time away from Hertfordshire had done nothing to diminish his secret admiration for her. Of course, he had used the excuse of wanting to protect Elizabeth from George Wickham as his reason for accompanying his friend to Hertfordshire. He certainly wanted that. But if he were to be honest, if to no one but himself, he would confess that part of his reasoning for agreeing to return with Bingley so easily as he had was to confirm that his admiration for the young woman had been nothing more than a passing fancy, that her bewitching effect upon his sensibilities had been fleeting. At 27, he was long past the point where he might suffer infatuation for a young woman. Lust? Indeed, for he was a healthy young man. Suffer it he might, but it was not as though anything would become of it. He was a gentleman, and she was a gentleman's daughter. But the disparity in their respective stations in life was not inconsequential. Or so he had reminded himself so many times before. Sitting there next to her, he was no longer sure exactly what he was about. The last thing he meant to do was squander this chance to get better acquainted with her. Given her unusual quietness, he sought to break the silence between them. He cleared his throat. I hope I am not speaking out of turn, and if I am, I pray you will forgive me for saying this. But it appears your mother is not the only one who is less than overjoyed with the news of Miss Lucas's engagement. Elizabeth pursed her lips. To know my cousin Mr. Collins is to understand my predicament very well. Do you not approve of your relative? The man is ridiculous, Elizabeth exclaimed with excitement. Remembering herself, she said, Pardon my bluntness, sir. I am no stranger to hearing you speak your mind, Miss Elizabeth. After a pause, he added, It is but one of the things I admire most about you. For a moment, Elizabeth supposed there was a compliment in the gentleman's speech. But how could it have been? When had Mr. Darcy ever gone out his way to compliment her? I suppose you are correct in saying that. I suppose what I ought to have said is my friend is too good for Mr. Collins, but then again, hearing myself speak the words out loud also seems rather uncharitable, and I always like to be fair when I can. Do you not consider it to be a good match? I know for certain that the living in Hunsford is most advantageous. Your friend will be well provided for if that is what concerns you. Mr. Darcy, if I did not know better, I might think you are trying to put my mind at ease. I would not wish to see you worrying about your friend's future. I suppose I thought to thank you for your consideration. I am at your service, Miss Elizabeth. In a hushed tone, Elizabeth said, I suspect I should also be thanking you for the joy that has returned to my sister's face. Pardon? Your friend Mr. Bingley's return. I take no credit for that. Bingley insisted that being by your sister's side this season was his greatest wish. I dare say nothing would have prevented his return once his mind was made up. Sir, you always take such prodigious care of your friend. I dare say he would not be here if you had not sanctioned it. Whether you will accept credit for your part or not, I stand by my conviction, and because of that, I am in your debt. I confess, it is good to see my friend so happy. I feel the same as regards Jane. Therefore, in keeping with the spirit of the season, if nothing else, you must allow me to express my deepest gratitude toward you for being the means of reuniting my sister and Mr. Bingley. Chapter 9. Mrs. Bennet had gone through such prodigious length to assure her house guests, the gardeners, did not spend a single night in want of diversion. Indeed, she had so carefully provided for the entertainment of her brother and sister that they did not once sit down to a family dinner. That particular evening, several of the officers from the local militia, the Phillipses, and the Lucases were scattered about the main rooms of the manor house. Most importantly, Mr. Bingley and his friend Mr. Darcy were also in attendance. Donned in her gayest apparel, Mrs. Bennet had never been happier, were one to judge, by the ease with which she waltzed about the room, intermingling among her guests. Elizabeth was not sure if contrition or circumspect fueled the greater part of her behaviour that evening. Contrition, because, after what Mr. Darcy had done to reunite Jane and Bingley, the last thing she wanted was to be seen flaunting her friendship with the man who boldly professed hating Mr. Darcy to anyone who would listen. Though Mr. Darcy had subtly cautioned her to be wary of Mr. Wickham's charms, never had he spoken of the latter with the degree of vehemence that might give her cause for concern. Elizabeth's busy mind drifted to another festive evening from not so long ago, the Netherfield ball. She recalled clearly the words Mr. Darcy had uttered and what her response had been. Mr. Wickham is blessed with such happy manners as may ensure his making friends. Whether he may be equally capable of retaining them is less certain. He has been so unlucky as to lose your friendship, and in a manner which he is likely to suffer from all his life. Those had been the last words, nay, the only words the two of them had ever exchanged on the topic of Mr. Wickham. Is there any wonder I have relied so heavily as I have on my belief in Wickham's goodness? Mr. Darcy's opinion of Mr. Wickham's character was just that, his opinion. Still, Elizabeth could no longer be wholly indifferent to Mr. Darcy's view, not any more, not since his return to Hertfordshire with his friend and during the Christmas season, when he might easily have discouraged Bingley had he wished it. Until I have a better understanding of Mr. Darcy's character, I think it is better that I do nothing that might garner his ire by cavorting with his enemy. Better I keep my distance from both of them this evening. Besides, with Jane and Bingley effectively lost in each other's eyes, I shall be thoroughly occupied keeping Kitty and Lydia from hovering beneath the mistletoe waiting for a poor unsuspecting officer to happen along. Longbourn's patriarch was in his study enjoying a much-needed and long-sought reprieve from the gaieties of the evening when the sound of the door opening punctured his solace.
"I supposed I'd find you here, sequestered with your books."
Mr. Bennet peered up from the page of his latest novel. Smiling, he placed his book aside.
"That is not to say I do not welcome the occasional diversion, brother."
Waving his brother-in-law into the room, he said,
"Pray come inside, have a seat."
Mr. Gardiner was a sensible, gentlemanlike man, greatly superior to his sister, as well by nature as education. As a consequence, he was one of Mr. Bennet's favourite relations. Mr. Gardiner walked into the room.
"There is certainly no lack of diversion just outside this door."
"Indeed, but if I may speak frankly, I have had more than my fill of that manner of diversion for the season. I dare say my favourite part of the season encompasses the small amount of time needed to light the Yule log on Christmas Eve and attend church on Christmas Day. Everything else is rather much ado about nothing. Twelfth night cannot come soon enough for me. A relief from all the festivities as a consequence of living in a household full of silly women," Bennet said. "I have lost count of the number of friends and acquaintances I have been forced to endure of late, present company excluded, of course," he added, almost apologetically. Now seated, Mr. Gardiner said,
"But, of course, speaking of a household full of acquaintances, what is your opinion of the two young men from Derbyshire?"
Bennet leaned back in his chair.
"I find it interesting that you would ask me about the gentleman from Derbyshire, specifically when there are several young men from various other parts of England lingering about, and hovering under the mistletoe no less."
"That is true, but only two of them share a history riddled with contention."
"True enough, if one were to rely solely on the count of one of the gentlemen, the one who complains to everyone who will listen of his being ill-used."
"It is indeed difficult to determine what is the truth when one man is so verbose in his complaints, and the other is rather mum on the subject."
"Yes, Mr. Wickham is quite indiscriminate when discretion ought to be the rule. However, what he lacks in reserve, he more than compensates for with his abundant charms. I do not mind telling you that he is a favourite here at Longbourn, doing all he can to make love to all of us in our turn."
"I dare say you take no umbrage with his influence on your daughters?"
"I do consider Wicker harmless where my Jane is concerned, as she is so hopelessly in love with the amiable Mr. Bingley. As for my Lizzie, she is far too sensible to fall in love with a man of Wickham's character. She may enjoy all the flattery and attention he so willingly bestows, but I believe she is half in love with a far more consequential gentleman, even if she does not yet realise it."
"Say no more, for that is a fine testament to Lizzie's sensibilities, to be sure. But what of your younger daughters? Do you really suppose they are safe?"
"Men of Wickham's ilk are Mary's abhorrence, and thus warrant none of my concern whatsoever for her," Mr. Bennet scoffed. "Can you imagine Wickham sitting through one of Fordyce's sermons?"
Here both men chuckled in spite of themselves.
"As regards Kitty and Lydia," Mr. Bennet continued, "a man like Wickham would have to be a fool to pay either of them more than a passing glance, and Wickham is no fool. He strikes me as just the sort of fellow who will hold himself out for the highest bidder. Nothing less than an heiress with £10,000 will do."
Chapter 10. Later, Mr. Gardiner and his wife were sitting together when Mr. Darcy walked alongside his friend, Mr. Bingley, into the room. From the looks of it, the young men were returning from a quick escape outside. Of the Gardiner's opinion of the latter, they were entirely of one accord. Bingley was as much in love with Jane as everyone had claimed. Their niece was on the precipice of future felicity in a marriage that she so richly deserved. Of that, they were utterly convinced. Both of them were of the same mind as regarded Mr. Darcy as well. They could not help but notice that of all the people at the festive gathering, their niece Elizabeth was the chief object of the young man's fascination. Mr. Darcy is a fine gentleman, said Mrs. Gardiner. Mr. Gardiner nodded, bolstering his wife's assertion.
Albeit rather reserved, no doubt a consequence of his circumstances in life. Indeed, he is just as a young gentleman of his station ought to be, perfectly well behaved, polite, and unassuming, said her uncle.
There is something a little stately in him, to be sure, replied his wife, but it is confined to his air, and is not unbecoming. Though I have heard more than a few people call him proud since our arrival in Hertfordshire, I have seen nothing of it.
Nor I, to be sure.
Having spoken with him at length earlier this evening about the goings-on in Lambton, I can say there is something pleasant in the way he speaks that would not give an unfavourable impression of his character. It is a shame that Lizzie's mind has been so thoroughly poisoned against him that she is blind to his true character.
Is she indeed?
The gentleman arched his brow.
I certainly hope her fascination with the other gentleman from Derbyshire is not the reason she dislikes Mr. Darcy.
I am afraid it is. However, only to a degree. No. I am afraid Lizzie's initial impression of Mr. Darcy was set almost from the moment the two of them first laid eyes on each other.
Oh, I have heard of love at first sight, but hate at first sight? That is a novel concept indeed.
I am afraid she overheard the gentleman remark to his friend, Mr. Bingley, that she was merely tolerable and not handsome enough to tempt him.
Say no more, my dear, for I fear Mr. Darcy's fate is sealed.
Perhaps. His fate need not be as dire as it seems. He is a perfect gentleman if I ever met one. Were I a gambling woman, I would wager he did not mean a single word of his poorly timed speech.
How can you be so certain?
Have you not seen the way he looks at our Lizzie when he thinks no one else is watching? I wager if he had any notion of how his words fashioned our niece's opinion of him, he would do everything in his power to make amends. That is just the kind of gentleman he is. It would be a shame for Lizzie to hold on to her resentment towards a gentleman of such consequence over a mere misunderstanding. Mrs. Gardiner pursed her lips in contemplation. If only there were a way to get the two of them in a room, just the two of them, with no chance for an interruption. I am certain the ill will on our niece's part might disappear.
What are you suggesting? For if it is what I think it is, what of the possible impropriety?
Were it in my power to bring the two of them together, I would exercise every precaution to guard our niece's reputation. You need not worry about that.
It sounds as though you have a particular scheme in mind.
Indeed I do. However, I will need your help in bringing it about.
My wife, the matchmaker.
Mr. Gardiner laughed a little at this picture of the woman who owned his heart.
I fear you have been in company with my sister for far too long.
Pray do not suppose me to be as cunning as that. I am not suggesting that Mr. Darcy might marry our niece. I simply mean to give the young people a chance to speak in privacy for a quarter-hour or so. Nothing more.
So long as your scheme does not involve mistletoe, I will do what I can.
Chapter 11. The night was cold, and the sky was clear. How the light blanket of snow that had accumulated earlier in the day glistened. And the stars, oh, how they stretched out as far and wide as Elizabeth's eyes ever beheld. Such a dazzling display of heaven's magnificence alone was a balm to her spirits. Oh, to stay here and marvel at the night sky forever. Beginning to suffer the consequence of fleeing the manor house with only a shawl draped about her shoulders to fend off the wintry night air, Elizabeth thought about going back inside, but the remembrance of the spectacle that her younger sisters, her mother, and even her aunt Mrs. Phillips were making of themselves caused her to think better of that particular scheme. Her family's behaviour was beyond the pale, recalling her to the evening of the Netherfield ball. Her two younger sisters had spent most of the evening in shameless pursuit of the officers. Her sister Mary, despite her best intentions, had delivered a less than spectacular exhibition of her musical talents on the pianoforte, rendering herself a laughingstock among their neighbours and even her own father. And her mother had boasted aloud to anyone who would hear that her eldest daughter would soon be married to Mr. Charles Bingley. Even her ridiculous cousin, Mr. William Collins, had been a great source of embarrassment when he had presumed an acquaintance with the proud Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth blew out a resigned breath into the chilly air. Any remembrance of that evening inevitably led to thoughts of the events that unfolded in the days immediately afterward. Mr. Bingley's leave-taking to London with the tacit promise of a timely return, the rest of the Netherfield party's subsequent departure, Miss Bingley's letter of explanation to Jane, and Jane's ensuing heartbreak. All of that is behind us now, for Mr. Bingley has returned, and it is as though he never left, for his affection for Jane is as ardent as ever, perhaps even more so. Elizabeth wrapped her arms around her shoulders in an attempt to warm herself. Mr. Bingley loves Jane despite my family's unseemly behaviour. I am confident he will make her an offer of marriage soon. She was not quite ready to surrender her solitude, but sensing she was no longer alone, Elizabeth's heart sped up a bit. A tall, dark figure emerged from the shadows. Mr. Wickham, she said, curtsying. Under different circumstances, an earlier time, another place, she would have been happy for his intrusion, but not that night, when she had spent the better part of it going out of her way to avoid him. My dear Miss Elizabeth, said the gentleman, bowing, I saw you escape the room a little while ago, and I thought I might follow your lead. Would you mind if I joined you? Actually, sir, I was just about to return to the house. Indeed, I must return, for surely it would not bode well for me to be seen alone with the gentleman by someone. And by someone, she meant the other gentleman who hailed from Derbyshire. So far as others were concerned, Elizabeth had made no secret of the fact that Mr. Wickham was a favourite of hers, but her preference for the gentleman was not worth risking her good reputation. Pray, you will indulge me for a little while, for there is something that I have been meaning to discuss with you all evening. Alas, fate has conspired to keep us apart, until now. I shall not impose on your generosity for very long. With a bit of reluctance, Elizabeth threw a quick glance over her shoulder. Thus assured of their privacy, she acquiesced. What is it that you wish to discuss with me? It has to do with the return of my old friend, Darcy, to the environs, and at Christmas, no less. I truly supposed he would be spending the season with his noble relations, especially his intended. His intended? Elizabeth exclaimed with energy, and rather inexplicably so, in her view. Yes, his cousin, Miss Anderberg. You do remember that I told you about her when the two of us talked at Mrs. Phillips's home, do you not? It has been a long favourite wish of his aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, that her daughter and Darcy will wed and unite the two great estates of Pemberley and Rosings Park. Elizabeth nodded. Yes, of course, I do recall your telling me. The Darcy that I know would never countenance being surrounded by those whom he deems beneath him in consequence, especially at such a time of year as this, and yet he is here. What do you suppose can be his purposes? I believe he is here in service to his friend Mr. Bingley. Good fellowship is the essence of the season, is it not? Ah, yes, and no doubt Darcy takes prodigious care of Bingley, almost to a fault. In such a case as this, I cannot find any fault at all in Mr. Darcy's behaviour, for Mr. Bingley's return has been a Christmas wish come true for my dearest sister Jane, she heard herself say, even if she wondered at the irony of defending Mr. Darcy again, and to Wickham of all people, the same person with whom she had happily chastised the former so many times before. Bingley's return has no doubt put an end to any speculation of an alliance between Miss Darcy and him. Elizabeth immediately regretted that she had been the one to confide in Wickham the contents of Miss Bingley's letter, especially the part that asserted, I really do not think Georgiana Darcy has her equal for beauty, elegance, and accomplishments, and the affection she inspires in Louisa and myself is heightened into something still more interesting from the hope we dare entertain of her being hereafter our sister. Elizabeth could not be too hard on herself. At the time, however, I felt I had no other choice. If anyone could shed light on the veracity of Miss Bingley's claim, it was Mr. Wickham who had boasted of an acquaintance with Miss Georgiana Darcy. Your family must be equally pleased by Bingley's return, Wickham said. It is apparent that he cares a great deal for Miss Bennet. I foresee another wedding in Meryton in under 3 months. By another, Elizabeth supposed he was referring to her friend Charlotte's pending nuptials to Mr. William Collins, which was planned to take place soon after the vicar's return from Kent. If indeed you are correct in your supposition,
Then once again I must confess it would be a blessing for my sister.
It will surely make up for Mr. Collins's defection.
Pardon me, sir?
Forgive me for being indelicate, but surely you do not suppose it is a secret that Mr. Collins's purpose in coming to Hertfordshire was to choose a bride from among the Bennet daughters, only to choose Miss Lucas instead.
Elizabeth coloured. She said nothing.
It is also no secret that you were the original object of his affections, that you spurned his offer of marriage.
I suppose you must think I am rather imprudent to have spurned the hand of the heir of my father's estate.
On the contrary, Miss Elizabeth. Indeed, I applaud your decision. Your lively spirits would have placed you in grave danger of unhappiness of the acutest kind had you consented to such an arrangement.
I must beg your pardon, sir, and ask that we speak on any other topic but this. As you said, it is rather impolitic.
Your point is well taken. Besides, there is a more urgent matter I wish to discuss with you. A gush of cold air afforded Elizabeth a much-desired means of escape.
Perhaps you and I can discuss it inside. I have been away from the house much longer than I intended.
I promise that what I have to say to you will not take long, and if I know you so well as I suspect, you will be pleased when you hear it. Here, he cleared his throat. You see, Miss Elizabeth, I have come to consider Mr. Collins's loss as my gain.
I'm afraid I do not understand how that might be.
You are much too, dare I say, passionate for such a man, whereas I am just the sort of man who can appreciate you in a manner a woman wants to be appreciated by a member of the opposite persuasion.
Elizabeth knew enough about the opposite persuasion, as Wickham had put it, to know that at that moment the gentleman was very much in her power, an increasingly telling observation that made her somewhat uncomfortable, and she felt the danger of being alone with him. That he was a consummate gentleman, she had not the slightest doubt, but he was a man, and she a maiden, and they were all alone, and still, despite how much she admired the gentleman standing before her, his nearness aroused in her none of the feelings she felt when she found herself standing so close to Mr. Darcy. Confounded, she took a step back. He stepped forward, erasing the distance she meant to put between them. He took her by the hand. For a second, Elizabeth relished the warm touch of his ungloved hand against her cold fingers, but just for a second. She tried to pull her hand away. Wickham would not let her.
Miss Elizabeth, you cannot be a stranger to the depth of my feelings toward you. Certainly no other woman can boast of having captured my unabashed admiration as ardently as you have.
Heavens! I fear Mr. Wickham intends to propose marriage to me.
Her heart had not been touched by Wickham, but neither had it been touched by Mr. Darcy.
This is no time to be thinking of Mr. Darcy, and yet I find it almost impossible to do otherwise. What on earth is happening to me? Standing so close to one gentleman, yet terribly preoccupied with another.
The sound of approaching footsteps and a man clearing his throat drew Elizabeth's attention. Her heartbeat sped up. Mr. Darcy was headed in her direction. The prospect of Mr. Darcy seeing her with Wickham was the one thing she had hoped to avoid that evening. She jerked her hand free of Wickham's.
What must he think of finding the two of us alone?
Miss Bennet, how fortunate that I found you.
Espying no hint of disdain or even disappointment in his eyes, Elizabeth said, "Pardon, sir. Do you mean to say you were looking for me?"
Indeed I was, on behalf of your elder sister. She has been asking about you, and I assured her I would find you. She is in the parlour.
After bowing for the benefit of both gentlemen, Elizabeth was gone directly.
His arms crossed, Darcy demanded, "What are you doing, Wickham?"
Wickham tugged at his red coat. Poking his chest in defiance, he declared,
"I assure you that I would be doing much more had you not interrupted me when you did. You are a bigger fool than I supposed if you think I would stand by idly and watch you ruin Miss Elizabeth's reputation." "So you do not deny that you followed me for the express intention of thwarting my purposes?" "I have no wish to deny it. What does any of this have to do with you?" "It has everything in the world to do with me. You cannot be a stranger to the fact that an alliance between Charles Bingley and Miss Bennet is practically a foregone conclusion. Do you think I would allow you to sully his future sister's reputation?" Wickham scoffed. "Is that what you tell yourself?" "What is that supposed to mean?" "Come now, Darcy, you may be able to fool these country nothings, but you do not fool me. I have seen the way you look at Elizabeth Bennet when you suppose no one notices. You want her. It is most unfortunate that your high opinion of yourself places her so far beneath you for any serious consideration. Not that it matters, for the lady barely knows you're alive. How could she when she is blinded by her infatuation with me? I will not deny that you have insinuated yourself into the lady's good graces with your happy manners. Were she to learn the truth about you, I doubt you would retain her good opinion for even a second." "Ah, the truth. And what exactly is the truth, Darcy? That I came within a few hours of marrying your precious sister? That she was perfectly willing to spurn society by agreeing to elope with me? Is that the truth to which you refer?" "I warned you to never mention my sister's name again," said Darcy, assuming an attitude far more menacing than it had been moments before. There they stood, just the two of them. The standoff of standoffs ensued. One man, an officer, trained to defend, to attack, to kill. The other, a gentleman, someone of sense and education, of noble lineage and extensive patronage, someone whose power to affect the livelihood of others was immeasurable. Both honourable and respectable in the eyes of society and the world in general. That was not, however, how they looked upon each other. In Mr. Darcy's eyes, George Wickham was a scoundrel, a reprobate, a scourge on society. In Wickham's estimation, Fitzwilliam Darcy was the spoiled, sanctimonious offspring of a rich and powerful man, and one who would be nothing at all if not for the circumstances of an advantageous birth. Equal importantly, one with little regard for those whom he considered beneath him in consequence. Which would be the victor in a battle of fisticuffs? There had been many a scrimmage between the two of them over the years. Reared together, despite the vast disparity of their stations in life, what with one being the son of the steward of the other's father, there was once a time when the two regarded themselves as friends. That was a long time ago. Before their time away from Pemberley at university, when Darcy grew to recognise Wickham's character precisely for what it was. The vicious propensities, the want of principle, all those loathsome qualities he had carefully guarded from Darcy's late father. Both men maintained their defensive stances, arms raised just so, fists clenched. "Go ahead, Darcy, take the first punch," Wickham said tauntingly. "I dare you. Only, have a care, for you shall not find your odds of success nearly so high as when you accosted me in Ramsgate when I wasn't prepared." Darcy felt his anger increasing with each passing second. Never had he hated anyone more than he hated the vile creature standing before him. The thought that Miss Elizabeth could be fooled even a second by the man's charms angered him even more. The very thought of what Wickham had intended for Darcy's 15-year-old sister sickened him still, despite the transgression having occurred some months ago. As if he read Darcy's mind, Wickham asked, "How is your lovely sister?" His countenance marred by his self-satisfied smirk. "Does she still cry herself to sleep longing, nay, aching, for me?" In an instant, Wickham's backside landed painfully against the ground. Grasping for breath, he clutched his chest with both hands. The sound of another gentleman's voice halted Darcy's next move. "There you are, Mr. Darcy."
Keeping a cautious eye on his nemesis sprawled on the ground, his bright red coat a striking contrast to the glistening snow, Darcy saw Miss Elizabeth's uncle from Cheapside quickly approaching them from afar. If he had any indication of what was transpiring, he gave no clue. When he was close enough, the gentleman paid Wickham no notice at all.
"Mr. Darcy," he began, "may I prevail on you to join me inside for a drink? I am sure it is exactly what is called for after standing about so long in the cold. I implore you to come with me. You will not regret it, for you see I know where my brother Bennet keeps his finest brandy."
A quick glance over at Wickham, who was still struggling to recover his composure, told Darcy he was wasting his time. Silently accepting the other man's invitation, Darcy joined him by his side, and the two men turned and walked away. With any luck, Wickham would slither off like the snake that he was, and would not be seen or heard from for the rest of the evening, at least. Good riddance. Chapter 12. Upon inspecting his hand and silently offering thanks that there was no evidence of his lapse in reserve, Darcy said, "Allow me to thank you again for your discretion as regards the incident you witnessed between Wickham and me, sir. I do not often allow the man to provoke me so easily as he managed this evening."
"No doubt the lieutenant is not one of your favourite people,"
said Mr. Gardiner. Darcy said, "There is a fair amount of animosity between the two of us, but as much as I respect you, sir, I am wont to keep the particulars to myself. Suffice it to say that I have long history with the gentleman owing to a familial connection."
"Yes, I understand that he was your late father's godson."
"My excellent father, may he rest in peace, had a particular fondness for his godson, one that I might never understand even if I might live to be 2 centuries old." Fully aware that the proud gentleman standing before him was a serious man who never countenanced frivolity at his own expense, as a consequence of an earlier discussion the two men had shared, Mr. Gardiner laughed a little inside at this view of a centuries-old Mr. Darcy. A servant walked into the parlour and handed a note to Mr. Gardiner. Pardoning himself, he stepped away from Mr. Darcy and began reading the note. Moments later, he chuckled.
"My children beckon."
He shook his head.
"It appears a father's work is never done."
Looking at Mr. Darcy, he said,
"Pray you will remain here and partake in my brother's finest brandy. I shall not be away for very long."
Mrs. Gardiner and her niece escaped the parlour and walked side by side through the hallway. "I suppose you are wondering why I have taken it upon myself to steer you away from all the evening's festivities, my dear."
"I assure you it is no inconvenience. Indeed, I welcome a reprieve."
Elizabeth spoke nothing but the truth. She had neither seen nor heard a whiff of Lieutenant Wickham ever since their chance encounter outside the manor house. She could honestly say she did not wish to, especially if he was about to do what she thought he was on the verge of doing.
Even if his intentions were honourable, and I have no reason to suspect that they were not, I am not sure I am of a mind to entertain another marriage proposal so soon after Mr. Collins's.
Her ridiculous cousin's patronising words came to mind.
"You should take it into further consideration that in spite of your manifold attractions, it is by no means certain that another offer of marriage may ever be made you."
Any remembrances of that day were unpleasant memories, ones Elizabeth preferred not to entertain.
"On the other hand, I do know that a proposal from a man whom I have come to admire and respect as I do Mr. Wickham would not be the worst thing, despite my aunt's tacit discouragement. I suppose there will be time enough to find out what Mr. Wickham is about tomorrow."
Immersed in her own thoughts, Elizabeth hardly noticed the servant who approached them with a missive in hand for her aunt. Accepting it, the older woman hastily perused its contents. She sighed. "It would appear a mother's work is never done."
"Is something the matter?"
Elizabeth asked. "Oh, it is nothing that will not require more than a few minutes of my time. The children beckon, you see. Pray, run along ahead, dearest Lizzie. I will not be long, and whatever you do, promise to wait for me in the east parlour, because I have something I wish to tell you that is of vital importance." Chapter 13. Pushing the door open, Elizabeth walked into the room and was surprised to find it occupied.
"Mr. Darcy!"
she cried, startled to see him, his arm leaning against the mantelpiece, a glass of brandy in his hand. Her heart fluttered a bit at this vision, surprising her more than she would have supposed possible. He spun around and faced her. "Miss Elizabeth." The soft roar from the fire in a room awash in bright candlelight, combined with the smell of dried lavender and rose petals prepared earlier during the year and inserted in small porcelain vases artfully placed in various nooks, afforded all the makings of a romantic interlude for those of a romantic bent. As it was, there were just the two of them, their chances for romance effectively nil so far as Elizabeth was concerned.
"Sir, what are you doing in here?"
"I am waiting for your uncle, Mr. Gardiner."
He and I were enjoying a drink.
Here he held up his glass as proof.
When he was called away, he said something or other about her father's work.
It's never done?
Elizabeth interrupted, her expression as well as her tone questioning. Yes,
Darcy replied.
Yes.
Elizabeth felt the colour rush all over her body. She realised now that her aunt and uncle must have conspired to bring the two of them together. But why? I suspect my uncle had an ulterior motive in asking you to await his return.
Why do you suppose?
My aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, gave me specific instructions to come to the East Parlour and wait here until she arrives. That was just after she received a note and made some mention that her mother's work
is never done,
said Darcy knowingly. Elizabeth nodded, her expression apologetic. Darcy frowned a little. I'm sorry, Elizabeth cried. Perhaps I should leave.
No. What I mean to say is please, stay with me a while. That is, until your aunt arrives. No doubt she wants the two of us to talk, in privacy. If that is indeed the case, I am in her debt.
I saw the two of you talking at length earlier this evening.
Indeed. It appears we share mutual acquaintances with a number of families in and about Lambton, a small village just 5 miles from Pemberley, my home.
Seconds later, a servant entered the room. She approached Elizabeth and handed her a note. It's from my mistress, Miss Elizabeth. Accepting it, Elizabeth said, My aunt, Mrs. Gardiner? The young lady nodded. Yes, ma'am. I'm to remain here while you read it and await your instructions. Quickly perusing the missive, which was indeed in her aunt's handwriting, Elizabeth said, I suppose you ought to make yourself comfortable. Yes, ma'am. I shall sit by the window and attend my sewing. You won't even know I'm here. And with that, the young girl curtsied and headed to the opposite side of the room. It appears our initial suspicions are correct. My aunt and uncle have conspired to have the two of us spend time in each other's company. I fear you must really hate me now.
Hate you, Miss Elizabeth? I think not.
Do you not suppose this entire scheme rather untoward?
On the contrary. Having spoken at length with your aunt earlier this evening, I am quite persuaded that her intentions are good.
I must confess to being quite surprised you and my aunt spoke with such enthusiasm, but I have heard it said that you are lively enough among those whom you consider your equal in consequence. You are aware, are you not, that my uncle and aunt live in Cheapside, within the view of my uncle's factories?
I am indeed. If you will allow me to guess the source of your information, no doubt your source is George Wickham. Were I you, I would not give credence to a word that gentleman has to say.
I am not surprised to hear you speak that way, especially given all he has had to say about you.
I would like to think you know me well enough to be suspect. Has the time we spent together done nothing to help you form a favourable impression of my character?
Why do you suppose that is, sir? Do you attribute it to your being master of one of the finest estates in all of Derbyshire, with all the much-needed wisdom and potential for benevolence such a lot in life entails?
I suppose that is part of it. I do tend to rely on my own counsel for the most part. Arranging matters to suit my own convenience is a natural extension of that. I do like to suppose that I take the wishes of others into consideration when it is clear to me how much he or she values it.
Are you speaking specifically of your being here in Hertfordshire for Christmas at your friend Bingley's estate, when you have the means to surround yourself with people of nobility, of untold wealth and privilege?
It is true that Bingley would not rest until I agreed to accompany him back to Netherfield, but, on the other hand, I confess that my motives in returning were not wholly altruistic.
Oh?
Indeed. In leaving Netherfield when I did, I feel I left a part of me behind. A part of me that I never fully embraced.
Not certain where their conversation was headed, and not sure she wanted to know, Elizabeth surmised a change in conversation was due. Something safe. Something threadbare. Some talk of the weather would certainly do. She threw a lingering glance outside the nearby window. On such a beautiful wintry night as this, we would be remiss not to speak of it, would we not? Elizabeth was on the verge of speaking when she heard the gentleman say,
It has been a very long time since I have borne witness to such an amazing view of the stars.
As amazing as this view is, I am quite certain it pales in comparison to the view from Pemberley. I have to wonder at your not being there with your family.
Were I at Pemberley at this moment, as spectacular as the view may very well be, I fear I would be admiring it all alone.
But your sister, Miss Darcy,
is visiting a dear friend in Bath.
And what of your aunt, the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh?
She is in Matlock, visiting her brother, Lord Matlock.
You might have visited your Matlock relations as well, especially considering...
Considering what, Miss Elizabeth?
Well, surely both her ladyship and her daughter, Mr. Bourgh, are both in Matlock for the season?
Darcy nodded. They are indeed.
Are you not obliged to attend your cousin during such an auspicious occasion as Christmas affords?
Why would I be?
Sir, are you and your cousin not engaged to be married?
Married? No doubt I have George Wickham to thank for planting such an idea in your mind.
Darcy ran his long fingers through his hair before drawing in a deep breath.
Miss Elizabeth, he said with a deliberate measure of calmness, one of my biggest regrets, when the two of us stood opposite each other during the dance at Netherfield, is the fact that we spoke of George Wickham. I know how much you like him, and if I am to be honest, for the first time in my life, I actually envied the man. I can only imagine to what lengths he might have gone to poison your mind against me. I have only myself to blame for your believing him. What did I do, after all, during my stay in Hertfordshire, than go out of my way to prove my indifference towards you and everyone you hold dear? I promised myself that given a chance, I would be more open with you. If you will allow, I should like to begin by sharing my own account of my past with George Wickham, for there are things I believe you are beginning to suspect about him, if I am to judge by the speed in which you escaped his side earlier this evening.
Elizabeth said nothing, which Mr. Darcy interpreted as sufficient encouragement to continue his speech.
My father loved Wickham. He treated him as though he were his own son. He was Wickham's godfather.
Elizabeth nodded. Yes, I know.
Of course, boasting of his connection to my family is Wickham's fondest stratagem. It gives greater credence to his complaints of being ill-used. No doubt he told you of the living in Kimpton which was meant to be his.
Then you do not deny the truth of his claims?
I have no reason to deny it. When my excellent father died about 5 years ago, his attachment to Mr. Wickham was to the last so steady that in his will he particularly recommended it to me to promote his advancement in the best manner that his profession might allow, and if he took orders, desired that a valuable family living might be his as soon as it became vacant. There was also a legacy of £1,000.
Then, if I might be so bold as to ask, why did you deny him that which was meant to be his? Elizabeth asked.
Wickham wrote to inform me that, having finally resolved against taking orders, he hoped I should not think it unreasonable for him to expect some more immediate pecuniary advantage, in lieu of the preferment, by which he could not be benefited. He said he had some intention of studying law, and that the interest of £1,000 would be a very insufficient support for such an endeavour. I rather wished than believed him to be sincere, but at any rate was perfectly ready to accede to his proposal. I knew that Mr. Wickham ought not to be a clergyman. The business was therefore soon settled. He resigned all claim to assistance in the church, were it possible that he could ever be in a situation to receive it, and accepted, in return, £3,000. All connection between us seemed now dissolved.
Wickham's own testimony had been so contrary to Mr. Darcy's that Elizabeth knew not how to think or how to feel. She said nothing, encouraging Mr. Darcy to continue his account. After further elaborating on the detail of their ensuing estrangement and Wickham's vicious reaction as a consequence, Darcy went on to say,
his resentment was in proportion to the distress of his circumstances, and he was doubtless as violent in his abuse of me to others as in his reproaches to myself. After this period, every appearance of acquaintance was dropped. How he lived, I do not know, but last summer he was again most painfully obtruded on my notice. I must now mention a circumstance which I would wish to forget myself, and which no obligation less than the present should induce me to unfold to any human being.
Having said thus much, I feel no doubt of your secrecy. Having listened to his account thus far, Elizabeth's character demanded that she listen to the rest of what Mr. Darcy had to say. As though their thoughts were in alignment regarding the servant's presence, they moved a little closer. Thus assured of Elizabeth's discretion, Mr. Darcy continued in a hushed tone. My sister, who is more than 10 years my junior, was left to the guardianship of my mother's nephew, Colonel Fitzwilliam, and myself. About a year ago, she was taken from school, and an establishment was formed for her in London. And last summer, she went with the lady who presided over it to Ramsgate, and thither also went Mr. Wickham, undoubtedly by design, for there proved to have been a prior acquaintance with him and Miss Young, in whose character we were most unhappily deceived, and by her connivance and aid he so far recommended himself to Georgiana, whose affectionate heart retained a strong impression of his kindness to her as a child, that she was persuaded to believe herself in love, and to consent to an elopement. Here Elizabeth gasped aloud. Still she said nothing. She threw a glance in the servant's direction, and thus assured their conversation had not been overheard, she silently encouraged Mr. Darcy to continue. My sister was 15, which must be her excuse. After confessing her imprudence, I am happy to add that I owed the knowledge of it to herself. I joined them unexpectedly a day or two before the intended elopement. Georgiana, unable to support the idea of grieving and offending a brother whom she almost looked up to as a father, acknowledged the whole to me. You may imagine what I felt and how I acted. Regard for my sister's credit and feelings prevented any public exposure. Suffice it to say, I dealt with Wickham in my own way, in private. Darcy flexed his hand, perhaps unconsciously, and continued. Mrs. Young was, of course, removed from her charge. Mr. Wickham's chief object was unquestionably my sister's fortune, which is £30,000. I cannot help supposing that the hope of revenging himself on me was a strong inducement. His revenge would have been complete indeed. No sooner had Mr. Darcy completed his speech than Elizabeth's aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, entered the room. Her cheery expression immediately fell, for she no doubt surmised that her entrance had been rather ill-timed. Too sensible to risk making an awkward situation even more so, she said, Mr. Darcy, my dearest Lizzie, how can I make amends for my lengthy absence? Pray neither of you were terribly inconvenienced. Not at all, both Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth uttered in unison, thus introducing a bit of levity in the room that had moments before been filled with sombreness and even regret. Mr. Darcy said, It has been a pleasure, Miss Elizabeth. Bowing, he looked at Mrs. Gardiner, his expression one of gratitude, and then he was gone. Chapter 14. Alone in his apartment at Netherfield, Mr. Darcy had the pleasure of beholding a most magnificent star outside his window as he drifted off to sleep. Thoughts of his time alone with Miss Elizabeth in the East Parlour at Longbourn accompanied him. What if he had not happened upon her engaged in conversation with that vile George Wickham when he did? How different would her future have been had Wickham successfully perpetrated whatever despicable scheme he had in mind that evening? Fortunately, I was able to intervene on Miss Elizabeth's behalf when I did, this time. How I wish Miss Elizabeth had never laid eyes on George Wickham from the start. With that wish in mind, Darcy fell asleep. The thing about wishes, especially wishes made during the Christmas season, and most especially under the cover of a long winter's night's slumber and a dazzling star outside one's window, is they can come true even if only in one's dreams. All of his friends, new neighbours and acquaintances descended upon Netherfield that evening for what promised to be a most festive occasion, the much-anticipated Netherfield ball. Darcy was just as eager, if not more so than his friend, but his anticipation was well concealed. Twice before during his time in Hertfordshire the opportunity to dance with Miss Elizabeth Bennet had eluded him. The first by his own contrivance, nay, stubbornness, the second by hers. Tonight, all such pretensions cease, he silently vowed. Darcy watched and waited as Miss Elizabeth first danced with her relation Mr. Collins, and next with an officer, the latter whose conversation she, no doubt, found refreshing after what had appeared to be an exhausting affair with the former. When those dances were over, Miss Elizabeth returned to her friend Charlotte Lucas. Seeing his chance to address her in application for the next set, Darcy proceeded to do just that, surprising himself as much as her, no doubt, by his eagerness. Having received her acceptance, he walked away again immediately. Was she pleased by the distinction he had bestowed onto her? He did not know. He could not know, for he dared not look back. There was something about Miss Elizabeth Bennet that made Darcy forget what he was about. He, a man of sense and education and knowledge of the world, and one of the most sought-after gentlemen in all of England. Yet how insufficient are all these things in her eyes. What heightened anticipation accompanied him as he waited for the dancing to recommence. Time and again he consulted his watch. Minutes seemed like hours. Finally it was time, and he approached the ladies again to claim Elizabeth's hand. His calm attitude belied his true sentiments as they took their places. That she had bewitched him like no other woman before her was beyond a shadow of a doubt. He no longer bothered to hide his attraction to her, as evidenced by his invitation to her to stand opposite him on the dance floor. What did it matter, the looks from his friends' neighbours and their amazement in beholding the preference he had bestowed on her? Let them look. Let them talk if they will. Miss Elizabeth's opinion is the only one that matters. To Darcy's chagrin, the two of them stood some time without speaking a word. He had just witnessed the liveliness with which Miss Elizabeth had spoken to the officer, and he began to imagine she meant to punish him for some unintended slight on his part by denying him the pleasure of her charming wit and teasing smiles. It would not do, and thus end their deafening silence he must. A fortunate parting in the dance gave him time to fashion his speech. "This is a lovely dance," he heard himself say when they were reunited by the dance. "It is perhaps one of my favourites." Though his companion uttered not a single word, her expression spoke volumes. "You seem surprised, Miss Elizabeth." "Sir, I am indeed surprised to hear you say this is one of your favourite dances. I recall your saying you did not like to dance early on in our acquaintance." "I am afraid I may have said any number of things early on in our acquaintance which belie my true sentiments." "So you do like to dance?" "Very much so, Miss Elizabeth. With the right partner, I would happily dance the night away." "Then I must consider myself fortunate to enjoy the privilege," she replied. There it was, that hint of playfulness in her eyes that he admired so much. Flattery was not his strongest suit, but if such a stratagem was required to undo all the ill will his prior behaviour had borne, then he was not opposed to it at all. What great pleasure a pair of fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman can bestow. "I consider myself the fortunate one. I only wish that I had enjoyed the honour of standing opposite you sooner." To his delight, Elizabeth acknowledged Darcy's kindness with kind words of her own, rendering the nature of their intercourse throughout the rest of their dance both pleasing as well as stimulating. Verbal sparring was nothing new to the two of them. The ebb and flow of the dance allowed for the topic of the size of the room, the number of couples, even books. Anything to make up for all the times he had done or said anything that might have garnered her ire was said. "You surprise me, Mr. Darcy," Elizabeth uttered at length. "Oh? And why is that, Miss Elizabeth?" "I never supposed you to be such a great talker, and certainly not on the dance floor." "Sometimes one must speak a little, you know. It would look odd to be entirely silent for half an hour together. Besides, I know you well enough to suspect you take great pleasure in engaging conversation, even on the dance floor." "So you are gratifying my feelings?" Elizabeth asked. "Both our feelings, I hope. For I have always enjoyed taking part in stimulating intercourse with you, Miss Elizabeth, even when we are espousing opposing opinions." "Well, sir, if I am to be completely forthcoming, I must confess that I have often gone out of my way to challenge you, even to the point of expressing opinions that are not always my own." "So, you are confessing to enjoying such sport?" Elizabeth bit her lower lip, thus sending a surge of longing throughout his body. She nodded. "I am guilty as charged." "You are pardoned, Miss Elizabeth. Challenge me at will, for I would by no means suspend any pleasure of yours." Their hands joined in the dance. He held on a second or two longer than was necessary. He smiled. I am your humble servant. The two of them went down the other dance in much the same fashion as the first, each revealing a bit more of their individual characters to the other than either had ever allowed before. At length the dance was over, compelling Darcy and Elizabeth, albeit reluctantly, to part. They turned in the usual way and exited the dance floor. Darcy hoped that, at last, things had changed between them, and that he was well on his way to gaining her good opinion, perhaps even more. This time, he did look back at her. He watched as she drifted across the crowded room. Look at me, Miss Elizabeth. Look back at me. Chapter 15. 3 miles away, the curtains in Elizabeth's room were not drawn, which were just as they ought to be on such a night, for what a shame it would have been not to admire the beautiful stars glowing so brightly in the sky. Lying in her soft, warm bed, with her hands behind her head atop a fluffy white pillow, the events of the evening danced through her busy mind. Her puzzling encounter with Mr. Wickham, which she now deemed somewhat akin to stalking, her time alone in the East Parlour with Mr. Darcy, listening to his account of his family's history with the former, which she now considered faithful, her long-held belief that the first gentleman was good and the latter was bad, and her ensuing disappointment in herself that she had been so terribly wrong on both counts. How foolish I have been, she thought to herself. Pleased with the preference of one and offended by the neglect of the other, on the very beginning of our acquaintance, I have courted prepossession and ignorance and driven reason away, where either were concerned. Till this moment I never knew myself. Her sleepy eyes fixed on an unusually bright star, Elizabeth sighed. How I wish I never met Mr. Wickham. How different my opinion of Mr. Darcy, even my opinion of myself, might then be. A cold winter's night, stars brightly shining in the sky, a cosy, warm bed, all the makings of wishes coming true being in her favour, Elizabeth drifted off to sleep. The moment Elizabeth laid eyes on Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, she thought he was a handsome man. A proud man indeed, but who in his situation would not be? If only she had not overheard the gentleman tell his friend Charles Bingley that he considered her to be merely tolerable, not handsome enough to tempt him. From that moment on, Elizabeth's wounded vanity served as her compass, at least with respect to the haughty gentleman from Derbyshire. His every word she considered a rebuke, his every look merely a means of finding fault in her. As she was not the sort of female who was easily intimidated, she acted towards him in kind. Elizabeth's intimate friend Charlotte Lucas posited Mr. Darcy's actions were merely a mask for his increasing admiration toward Elizabeth. But what did Charlotte know? She had no more experience in the ways of the opposite persuasion than her friend, or such was Elizabeth's consolation. On the other hand, there Elizabeth now stood, having taken her place in the set, amazed at the dignity to which she was arrived in being allowed to stand opposite to Mr. Darcy, and reading in her neighbours' looks their equal amazement in beholding it. Elizabeth knew Mr. Darcy well enough to know that he was a rather taciturn man by nature, and if she did not say anything, the silence between them might last through the 2 dances. Not that she would have minded, except she dearly loved to dance, for one, and experience had taught her that talking while dancing made the excursion so much more enjoyable. Talk to Mr. Darcy she must, and thus she resolved to oblige him to say something, if necessary. When they were separated by the dance, she searched her mind for a topic that was sure to draw him out. "This is a lovely dance," she heard him say when they were reunited. "It is perhaps one of my favourites." Her astonishment in hearing this she could not repress. This was precisely what she had planned to say, for indeed this was one of her favourite dances as well. Do I dare parrot his declaration? Would he think me a simpleton? She said nothing. You seem surprised, Miss Elizabeth. Sir, I am indeed surprised to hear you say this is one of your favourite dances. I recall your saying early on in our acquaintance that you did not like to dance. I am afraid I may have said any number of things early on in our acquaintance which belie my true sentiments. So you do like to dance? Very much so. With the right partner, I would happily dance the night away. Quicker than she might have expected, her spirits rose to playfulness. Then I must consider myself fortunate to enjoy the privilege. I consider myself the fortunate one. I only wish that I had enjoyed the honour of standing opposite to you sooner. Playfulness turned to puzzlement as once again Elizabeth parted from her dance partner. Can this be Mr. Darcy? When they were reunited by the dance, Mr. Darcy said, I suppose now the proper thing for me to do is make some remark on the size of the room or the number of couples. In truth, I would hardly do any such discourse justice.
Pray, why is that, sir?
How can I speak of other things, other occupants in the room, when I only have eyes for you? No, this is most certainly not Mr. Darcy. It is one thing to ask me to dance, but to express sentiments akin to admiration, surely I must be dreaming. Just in case she was not dreaming, Elizabeth said, In such a case as this, I would be entirely remiss were I to allow such a generous remark to go unacknowledged, sir. Smiling, she thanked him. Seconds later, she thanked the heavens above when they were parted once more by the dance. His words affected her more than she wished. She had taught herself to be utterly immune to this man as a consequence of his insults she overheard him share with his friend Mr. Bingley at the Meryton assembly, that she was merely tolerable and not handsome enough to tempt him. Now was no time to let her guard down. Desirous of changing the subject when the dance again brought them together, Elizabeth said, What do you think of books, sir? Books? Yes, books. I am sure we never read the same books, or at least not with the same feelings. I'm sorry you think so, Miss Elizabeth. But if that be the case, there can at least be no want of subject. We may compare our different opinions. As I dearly love to read, I would be remiss were I to fail to accept such a challenge, would I not, sir? Indeed. But as we are currently so agreeably engaged, I would ask you if we might defer such stimulating intercourse until we find ourselves in a more intimate setting. Elizabeth smiled. It would seem the gentleman is not so taciturn as he would have others believe. It being her turn to speak, she replied, As much as I am hesitant to suspend such a stimulating pleasure as you are suggesting, Mr. Darcy, I am utterly inclined to agree. A ballroom setting such as this affords so many diversions to entertain. Smiling, Darcy said, I am your humble servant, Miss Elizabeth. Flattering words uttered from his lips were one thing, something readily discounted with the passage of time and waning recollection. But his look, his smile, whatever had been the gentleman's feelings before, one thing was now clear. Mr. Darcy was most definitely not looking at her to find fault. Elizabeth knew at once that she was in grave danger of actually liking Mr. Darcy. What was more, the night was still young. Their second set was just getting started. I dare not even think about what tomorrow might bring. The two of them went down the other dance in much the same fashion as the first, each revealing a bit more of their individual characters to the other than either had ever allowed before. At length, the dance was over, compelling them, however reluctantly, to part with the awareness of each side that to do otherwise might give rise to speculation neither of them desired. Both turned in the usual way and quit the dance floor, thinking rather than knowing that something had changed. After a moment or two, Elizabeth looked back and saw with great pleasure that the handsome and, yes, agreeable gentleman was looking back at her too, even as he drifted deeper and deeper into the crowd. I see you, Mr. Darcy. For the first time in our acquaintance, I see you. Chapter 16.
Good gracious!
Cried Mrs. Bennet, standing by a window and sneaking a quick look outside the next morning.
That disagreeable Mr. Darcy is coming here again with our dear Bingley. What can he mean by being so tiresome as to be always coming here? I had no notion but he would go shooting or something or other, and not disturb us with his company. What shall we do with him?
The agitated lady threw a frantic glance around the room at her daughters. Her panicky eyes landed on her second eldest.
Lizzie, she exclaimed with energy, you must walk out with him again, that he may not be in Bingley's way.
Elizabeth felt not the least bit inconvenienced by her mother's scheme. Yet she was really vexed that her mother should always be disparaging of a man of Mr. Darcy's character so brutally. As soon as they entered the parlour, Bingley's manner bore a measure of confidence none of them had seen since his return to Hertfordshire. Right before their eyes, it seemed, he was coming into his own. "Mrs. Bennet, pray what I am about to say does not come across as untoward, for it is my fondest wish to go for a walk with Miss Bennet this morning."
Why, by all means, I recommend the two of you walk to Oakham Mount. It is a nice long walk. No doubt you have yet to see the view,
said Mrs. Bennet.
Lizzie and Kitty will be happy to accompany you for Mr. Darcy's sake.
"It may do very well for the others," replied Mr. Bingley. "But I am sure a walk will be too much for Miss Kitty, will it not, Miss Kitty?" Kitty owned that she'd rather stay at home. Darcy professed a great curiosity to see the view from the mount, and Elizabeth silently consented. As she went upstairs to get ready, Mrs. Bennet followed her.
"I am quite sorry, Lizzie, that you should be forced to have that disagreeable man all to yourself," she began. "But I hope you will not mind it. It is all for Jane's sake, you know. There is no occasion for talking to him except just now and then. Whatever you do, do not put yourself to any inconvenience."
Darcy should have known better than to confide in his friend about spending time with Miss Elizabeth the evening before, and how agreeable their time together had been. However, disguise of any sort was his abhorrence, and thus it was the only way to explain his long absence from the rest of the party. On the other hand, had he not confided in his friend, then Bingley would not have taken it upon himself to play matchmaker, and Darcy would not have found himself walking alongside the beguiling young woman who had occupied the better part of his dream. When the four of them set out, Bingley and Jane lagged behind, allowing Darcy and Elizabeth to outstrip them. This was just as well, so far as the latter two were concerned. For Elizabeth's part, she dearly wished that this time alone for her sister and her lover might prove fruitful in keeping with her mother's desires as well as Jane's. For Darcy's part, any time alone with Elizabeth was time well spent. Emboldened by his dream, coupled with the time alone with her the evening before, he resolved never to squander another moment in her presence masking his admiration. Determined to execute his resolution, Darcy made some comment on a topic that he thought surely would liven his walking companion's uncharacteristically sombre spirits. "What books have you read of late, Miss Elizabeth?"
"Books, sir?"
"I know how dearly you love to read. At least, I was given to think so from observing your doing so while we were all at Netherfield."
"I do love to read, Mr. Darcy. It is just that I find it rather uncanny that you should be asking me about books."
"Uncanny? Do you care to elaborate?"
"I do not think I should, for fear that you might consider it rather inappropriate."
"Perhaps you will allow me to be the judge of that. Pray, why do you find it uncanny that I should ask you about books?"
"Well, sir, it is just that you asked me about books before."
"Ah, you mean at the Netherfield ball last month when we danced?"
"Actually, at the Netherfield ball last night during my dream."
"You dream of me, Miss Elizabeth? Of the two of us?"
"I did indeed," Elizabeth boldly owned. "Now, hate me if you dare."
"Hate you? I do not dare, for that would render me a hypocrite."
"Sir?"
"Would you believe me if I told you that I dreamed of you as well? Of the two of us at the Netherfield ball?"
Elizabeth gasped.
"It is true. I will share my dream with you if you will share yours with me."
Elizabeth demurred. I would rather not, sir."
"Then we shall both have our secrets," Darcy said. "I suppose that explains why you seem rather pensive this morning, Miss Elizabeth. I was concerned you were inconvenienced by my presence, especially after having passed so much of the past evening with me."
"No, sir," she replied. "I am not the least bit inconvenienced. However, I do feel as though I ought to be apologizing to you for my mother's not so subtle attempt to play matchmaker between my sister and your friend."
"No apology is needed, trust me. Indeed, Bingley is precisely where he wants to be."
"Then you do not object?"
"Object to my friend finding himself hopelessly in love? No, I do not object. It has been a long time since I have seen him so contented."
I might say the same for my sister. The time away from your friend casts such a pall on Jane's spirits. I know there are those who would say that the feelings the two of them suffer for each other were a short duration in the making, but I am a firm believer that love does not adhere to some superficial timeline. The heart wants what it wants when it wants it, and there is very little to be done about it by mere mortals.
Love at first sight is certainly within the realm of possibilities of mere mortal sentimentalities, I suppose.
As well as the opposing sentiment, said Elizabeth, her spirits rising to playfulness.
Are you suggesting hate at first sight is a viable sentiment, Miss Elizabeth?
Hate is a powerful word, and one which I would rather avoid attaching to anyone when I can help it. However, if I am to be honest, I must confess I was strongly prejudiced against you from almost the moment I laid eyes on you.
Oh?
Indeed.
Might I hope that your feelings have since changed?
I would say my sentiments have undergone quite material a change, sir.
Perhaps you might tell me the basis of your initial prejudice, for whatever was the cause, I should hate to commit a similar offence.
She eyed him directly. Do the words fairly tolerable but not handsome enough to tempt me mean anything to you?
Darcy coloured. I am sorry you had to hear that, Miss Elizabeth. Would that I could take it all back.
Ah, take it all back. Is that not the sort of thing that dreams are made of, sir?
Indeed, replied Mr. Darcy with a knowing smile. If it means anything, I must confess that it was not long after the evening at the Meryton Assembly that I began to consider you as one of the handsomest women of my acquaintance.
A companionable silence fell over them for a moment or two. Looking deeply into each other's eyes, at length, they spoke each other's names simultaneously. Feeling certain that he suffered the greater share of embarrassment, Darcy said,
Pardon me.
No, I insist you be allowed to speak first.
I leave for town this afternoon.
Her disappointment she did not try to suppress. So soon?
Darcy nodded. I must. I have business affairs to attend.
I see.
Have you any imminent plans to travel, Miss Elizabeth? To London, perhaps?
My sister Jane had planned to return to town with my uncle and aunt, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, at the end of the week.
Is there any chance of your joining them as well?
She looked at him questioningly. She said nothing, which encouraged him to say more.
My own uncle and aunt, Lord and Lady Matlock, will host their annual 12th night ball. I would love it if you will come.
Are you inviting me to attend your relation's ball, Mr. Darcy?
I am.
As your guest?
As my guest, and yes, I am well aware of all that such an arrangement entails.
I do not know quite what to say.
Say yes.
Before she could fashion a response, the sparkle in her amazing dark eyes and the pleasing turn of her lovely countenance told him all he needed to know. He took her hand in his and raised it to his lips. He bestowed a lingering kiss first on her knuckles and at length on the inside of her palm. Looking up, their eyes met.
To the promise of 12th night, he whispered, and everything which the new year will bring.
Elizabeth's sentimentalities were all aflutter. As suddenly as that, her future shone brighter than the late-night star which lulled her to sleep the night before. The feelings she suffered she had experienced the night before, during her dream. This was no dream. To the promise of 12th night indeed, she silently considered, her hand in his, relishing in the magic of his touch. Smiling, Elizabeth could not help wishing for many more Christmas-tides such as this, and delighting in the hope that her spirits may forever abound in all the gaieties which that season brings. This has been Which That Season Brings, written by P.O. Dixon, narrated by Christina Platt, copyright 2017 by P.O. Dixon, production copyright by P.O. Dixon.